A lot of viruses can be pathogens, and a pathogen is something that causes a disease in an organism, animals, plants. And viruses can become pathogenic or cause damage and disease in a couple of different ways. A lot of viruses damage by killing the cells that they attack. And this is a really common type of way to cause a disease. And the severity of the disease is going to be determined by what cells are being attacked and how well they can recover. So something like HIV is going to attack human immune cells. And so HIV doesn't typically kill people. What kills people is the fact that they have a low count of immune cells. They get AIDS and then they die of other things like a cold because they aren't able to fight it off. Something like a common cold in a healthy person, that tends to damage the cells in the lungs or the epithelia of like the respiratory system. But the immune system's able to kill off the virus and then replace those cells, so after a cold you typically recover just fine. Something like polio, which attacks nerve cells do not regenerate. So if polio kills a nerve cell, that nerve cell is typically not going to come back. So that's why people lost the ability to walk after getting polio, because they can't regenerate those nerves. Other ways viruses can infect cells is by producing toxins that can lead to the disease symptoms, or having components of the actual structure that are toxic, like the proteins in the envelope coat that are toxic to the person. We fight viruses with vaccines, and we have vaccines against bacteria and viruses, but there's not really a good way to fight a virus once it gets in the body. So typically the best way to prevent getting a virus is to prevent it in the first place. And so we do that through vaccination. And what a vaccine is it's a piece of that virus. It's usually either a piece of the virus itself that's been deactivated, so kind of broken, so it's no longer fully functional, or a derivative of that virus, so like just a part of it instead of the whole thing. And what we do is we introduce that to the body, and then the body is able to have an immune response. So what this would look like in a person, let's draw a graph. All right, so this is going to be on the left here, we're going to have the immune response, and then the bottom down here is time. So if somebody gets, let's say the flu, right? The flu might take you a couple weeks or a whole week to get over. So you get the flu, you get really, really, really sick. It takes you a whole week to get over it. And then eventually you get a little better, and then you recover. And later on in the flu season, let's say this was influenza A. You get influenza A again, so your kid brings it home from school, and you might get like a cough or a fever for a day and then feel better, and then you recover. If it's the same strain, if it's a different strain of flu, you would probably get fully sick again. And this is how the immune system works. The first time that it comes in touch with something, you have to mount a full immune response. You're going to have T cells, and then B cells are going to fight this off, as well as other things like macrophages. But at the end of the flu, some of these T cells and some of these B cells become memory cells, and they remember. So the second time you come in contact with the flu, these memory cells, they crush it really quickly, and you don't even probably know that you came in contact with the flu again. So this would be what would happen if you had not had a vaccine. But if you did get a vaccine, so let's use blue to represent the vaccine. So let's say you get vaccinated at the beginning of flu season. Sometimes when you get a vaccine, you actually get a minor fever or some rash and irritation, especially at the vaccine site. So what happens is you get your vaccine for influenza A. maybe you get a little rash or a little fever. It goes away in a couple of days, and then you're fine. And so that would count as your first initial exposure. What happens with that is your T cells and your B cells are told, hey, here's the influenza A strain for this season, and they're going to go ahead and store some memory. And then later on, somebody has the flu, your kid brings it home, and you don't have a huge immune response to it. The memory cells are able to crush it either before you have a large reaction. Some years that I've gotten the flu vaccine, I actually do get the flu and I'm sick for a couple of days, but it's much better than being sick for like weeks or really, really sick. And so by being vaccinated, you can have a mild response or even not even a noticeable response to the actual disease when you come in contact with it. The vaccines are definitely not perfect. So the flu is a virus that replicates really quickly. So every year we have to make vaccine strains before we actually have the flu virus strains. So the flu vaccine is kind of a guess. That's why it's more effective some years and less effective some years. That's why we can't cure the common cold, because cold viruses, rhinoviruses and coronaviruses that cause the common cold replicate and mutate really quickly. So if you get the flu, right, so let's say you didn't get your flu vaccine, you get a really bad flu, and one of the things you can do is go to the doctor and they will give you a antiviral. And this is something like a Tamiflu. And an antiviral is not going to cure it. What it does is it tries to just kind of help your body do it a little faster. And the antiviral drugs like Tamiflu only work if they're taken at the beginning of the flu. So if you get something like flu-like symptoms and you think it's the flu, you should go to your doctor right away, because if you wait 2-3 days even and then go to the doctor with the flu, they're going to say, sorry, there's nothing I can do. If you come in within 24 to 36 hours, the Tamiflu can actually help, and it can shorten the length of the flu, usually not the severity, but the length of the flu by 1 or 2 days. Antibiotics only fight bacteria. So if you've got a cold or the flu or COVID, anything that's a virus, an antibiotic is not going to help. Some of the antivirals that we're using right now to treat COVID-19 are things like hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, and these have not been through enough drug trials, for me to make any kind of, oh, this one works, this one doesn't. The idea behind an antiviral is they're trying to get it to people early. Usually by the time somebody's in the hospital with COVID-19, it's really late in the disease progression. Trying to give them an antiviral really late in disease progression is not going to do anything. So a lot of the drug trials for hydroxychloroquine are giving this drug in the hospital. And if you're using it as an antiviral, that doesn't make any sense. And there's some other things like vitamin D and zinc and azithromycin that we think might be functioning to help as an antiviral. But again, antivirals are only going to be good in the very beginning. I'm not a doctor. I do not have the answer to COVID-19, right? So you should definitely go to the doctor if you get sick. So an emerging virus is a virus that becomes suddenly apparent. So just like COVID-19, we have an outbreak. This happened with Ebola in Western Africa. We also had this happen with Zika virus recently in about 2015. And we had this happen with the swine flu, H1N1, in 2009. And so these are kind of the things that you hear about in the news. And it just means that it became suddenly apparent. And it's likely because there was a mutation, or it suddenly transferred to a larger population, or it jumped from one host to a new host, like the swine flu, or we think COVID-19. And so this virus emergence becomes a pandemic, which you guys should all be aware of what a pandemic is at this point. And so this word pan means kind of global or all over. So think Pangea was the entire world. Pandemic means the entire world is having an epidemic. And there's a couple of processes that lead to pandemics. Pandemics are often RNA viruses. RNA viruses do not have DNA polymerase. So DNA polymerase is the enzyme that does proofreading and checking for mutations. So RNA viruses have a really high rate of mutation, which just means that they have more opportunity to have kind of new virulent emergence. Sometimes these can be disseminated from a small isolated population and then spread around the world. So think about when Europeans came to America and they brought smallpox with them. And the Native Americans did not have any kind of innate immunity to smallpox. So having individuals transferring from one population to another brings with it the possibility of disease. And if you go into a population that has no immunity to that disease, you can end up causing massive pandemic issues. And then most pandemics are going to originate from animals. So this is going to come from the spread of animals to humans. And a lot of this can be contributed to the fact that we eat animals. So most farming, factory farming, which is most farming unless you're buying organic, grass-fed, free-range meat, most farming comes from factory farms. Factory farms keep animals locked up in teeny tiny cages and extremely densely packed, and they see massive die-off of animals from disease. Human pathogens wasn't really a thing until humans stopped being nomadic and started farming in place, where humans and animals were spending a lot of time in close contact. Humans are coming in contact with their feces, with their liquids, like with their saliva, all sorts of stuff, and then, cutting them up and eating their meat. And so 3/4, right, 75% of diseases have arisen from basically farming of animals, which we think is where COVID-19 came from. It came from something called a wet market in China. And a wet market is an animal market. So they have tons and tons of live and dead animals in one place. Some ideas of where this came from might have been from a bat and then from a pangolin. And a pangolin is a really rare mammal that has scales. And it is used in Chinese medicine. The scales are ground up and used as like medicinal herbs in Chinese medicine. And it's a black market thing. It's actually illegal to eat pangolins because they are endangered. The flu causes epidemics. We have a flu season every year, and the strain of the flu in each year is going to determine the specific, determines the virulency of the pandemic. The most recent pandemic that we had with the flu was the swine flu in 2009 called H1N1, and we believe that was a host jump from a pig, so you can see H1N1 right down here, jumping to humans and then being able to transmit it. So this is a new transmission. We didn't have protection against it, and then it transmitted rapidly. The H stands for hematogluten, and the N stands for neuraminidase. You don't need to memorize those, but the number stands for the different proteins on the surface of a flu virus. Viruses also cause diseases in plants because host ranges are so tight. Diseases that happen in plants do not typically jump to animals and vice versa. So you're not going to give COVID-19 to a plant. Most plant diseases have helical shapes, kind of like the mosaic tobacco virus. And there's a couple of different ways to transmit viruses among plants. Vertical transmission is from parent to offspring. So a diseased parent plant can transmit it to the next generation. And then horizontal transmission is what we typically think of, where a diseased plant transmits it to another plant that was already healthy through sap or through damage in the cell wall somehow. Not all pathogens are caused by viruses. We'll talk about bacteriopathogens and other organisms that are considered alive later, but there's another type of non-living pathogenic material called a prion, and a prion is a protein. So this is not genetic, it's not a virus, it doesn't have DNA or RNA. Typically what it is it's a piece of protein that gets folded into the wrong shape. So here would be the shape of the protein normally, and then here's the protein that is misfolded. So somehow they went from being an alpha helix to a beta pleated sheet here. And then what happens when the prions are folded incorrectly is they can actually induce other proteins by contact to become misfolded. And then they form these large aggregates of misfolded proteins. A lot of prion diseases are neural diseases. So scrappy is a prion disease in sheep. Mad cow disease is a prion disease in cows. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a prion disease in humans. And these prions become virtually indestructible. They typically act slowly, and then you would see the progression of the disease kind of slowly build up over time. We don't know if prions are involved in things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, but there has been some research to suggest that one aspect of these neurodegenerative diseases might be the buildup of these protein plaques. So in Alzheimer's, we have buildup of beta amyloid plaques, and those would be aggregates of proteins.